The truck's engine cut off just past the gate, and the night swallowed the sound like it was never there. Four men stepped out into the stillness, boots hitting gravel with slow, heavy purpose. They moved in a pack, relaxed, confident, weapons slung low as if they didn't expect to need them. One of them pointed at the porch light flickering like a warning and laughed. He said this was going to be easy, that no one on a place like this would put up much of a fight. Another said he'd bet the woman inside would start crying before she made it to the door. They fanned out across the yard, kicking over buckets and tapping on windows. One called out for the lady of the house to come say hello. The others chuckled, their voices loud against the silence of the land. They thought they were in control. Then it happened. A single shot cracked through the dark, clean and sharp. The leader screamed, his gun clattering to the ground as he dropped to one knee, clutching his shoulder. The other men froze, spinning in every direction, eyes wide, unsure where it came from. That's when her voice came calm and steady from somewhere unseen. Not tonight. Not here. They backed toward the truck, eyes scanning the trees, hearts racing now. The wind moved through the grass, carrying nothing but silence and the sudden weight of fear. Jane Miller didn't care much for attention. She lived in a quiet corner of Colorado where the land was rough, the sky stretched wide, and neighbors respected space more than small talk. At 37, she had a kind of calm that didn't need explaining. Each day started before the sun rose. She fed the chickens, checked the fences, and boiled water for coffee while her daughter still slept. Her boots were always dusty, and her shirts never quite new, but everything about her was steady and sure. She wore her hair pulled back in a loose braid and kept a pocket knife in her jeans, more out of habit than worry. The hands that dug in the garden were the same ones that once held a rifle with perfect control, but no one in town saw her that way. They saw the quiet woman at the farmer's market with a canvas bag and a little girl who clung to her side. Jane hadn't always lived like this. Years ago, she'd worn the uniform of a Green Beret sniper trained in deserts and forests, called by rank and trusted with lives. She had a sharp eye, a still hand, and a record that never needed defending. But all of that ended the day she lost her husband to an explosion overseas. She came home carrying their daughter and left the medals packed in a drawer. This farm had been his dream. Now, it was hers to protect. She didn't talk about her past. Folks assumed she'd been through something hard, but no one pried. Her world was now built on rows of vegetables, a creaky porch swing, and the sound of Lily's laughter as she chased chickens across the yard. Homeschooling came easy to her. She taught math with old chalk and grammar with read-alouds from faded books. When Lily asked about her dad, Jane told her stories of courage and love, not war. She wanted her daughter to grow up with roots, not ghosts. Most evenings they sat on the porch together, watching the sky turn from gold to blue. Jane's hands would be stained with soil, and Lily's face would still carry a bit of jam from supper. They didn't need much. Just peace. Just time. Some people mistook her quiet for weakness. They thought her life was small. But every nail in the barn, every acre she'd mended, was built with purpose. She had walked away from one kind of fight to protect what she now called home. And while no one saw the sniper anymore, the soldier hadn't gone far. She just chose where and when to show up. And always, always for the right reason. The farm sat at the edge of a long dirt road, tucked into a quiet fold of land, just outside a town most folks drove through without stopping. It was the kind of place where time didn't hurry, where the sound of wind in the trees was louder than any passing car. The house was old, painted white with patches of chipped wood that Jane always meant to fix, but never quite got around to. Each morning started slow. Jane moved through the routine like clockwork, feeding the chickens, watering the rows of green beans and tomatoes, brushing dust off the porch steps with the side of her boot. Lily helped where she could, dragging a small metal pail behind her, careful not to spill the feed. They ate breakfast together at the same old table her husband built before deployment. Jane made coffee in a battered percolator while Lily doodled stories on scrap paper. The world outside their windows was simple, quiet, and whole. Jane spent her afternoons teaching reading and basic science, mixing hands-on lessons with life on the land. They'd walk the fence lines, checking for breaks, collecting feathers and rocks to examine later. Evenings ended with a shared blanket on the porch swing, watching the last rays of sunlight melt into the hills. The quiet wasn't empty. It was filled with small rituals and steady love. But in early October, something shifted. Jane found tire tracks near the back fence where no truck had business being. The ground was dry enough to hold the pattern, deep enough to say someone had parked for a while. She didn't panic. just stared at the tracks, then walked the property like she always did. But her hand brushed the old latch on the barn door with a little more pressure that day. She noticed the quiet a bit more sharply. 2 days later, a plain envelope showed up in her mailbox. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper with 6 words in thick black ink. Sell now, before it gets ugly. Jane read it once, folded it twice, then slid it into the drawer beside the stove where she kept Lily's drawings and a spare flashlight. She didn't show her daughter, didn't speak it out loud, but something old stirred under her ribs. That night she double-locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight. She lay awake longer than usual, counting the creaks in the walls and the howl of wind outside. The farm was still, but the stillness didn't feel the same. The next morning she found a broken piece of wire along the western edge of the fence. It wasn't chewed. It wasn't weathered. It was cut, clean and fast. She fixed it before Lily noticed, wrapped the new wire tight and moved on. But from that day on she kept her eyes wider and her steps quieter. The land she loved, the life she built, suddenly felt like something that might be taken. And deep down she knew. Trouble wasn't coming. It was already here. The truck rolled in slow gravel, crunching beneath its tires like a warning whispered through the dirt. Jane stood on the porch, one hand resting on the railing, the other lightly pressed against her daughter's shoulder, as Lily peeked out from behind her. The vehicle stopped a few yards from the barn engine, still rumbling as 4 men climbed out. They didn't rush. They moved like men who thought they owned whatever they stood on. One of them laughed as he stepped toward the gate, eyes trailing over the house like he was already imagining it his. Another kicked at the mailbox and made a joke too crude for Lily's ears. The leader walked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Said he was there to make a deal, said he heard the land was available. Jane told him it wasn't, voice even, and low. He glanced at Lily and said, maybe she didn't understand how business worked out here. Jane asked them to leave. No yelling, no shaking hands, just the steady tone of someone who dealt with worse. One of the others scoffed and said she looked more like a schoolteacher than a landowner. They spread out across the yard like they were checking for weak spots. One walked around back without asking. Another leaned against her porch post, too close. They weren't trying to negotiate. They were trying to scare her. Lily tightened her grip on Jane's leg, and Jane gently pushed her back toward the screen door. Told her to go inside and stay there. Lily hesitated but obeyed, her small feet padding across the wooden floor. The leader chuckled and said he admired her courage, said it was cute. Then he nodded toward the barn and said his crew would be back tomorrow with papers. Jane didn't blink, didn't move. He called her stubborn, called her stupid, called her alone. Jane looked him dead in the eyes and told him he should leave while it was still his idea. That's when the laughter stopped. Another man stepped forward, said the law didn't care much about forgotten places like this. Said no one would hear if something happened. Said maybe she should think about what was best for her daughter. Jane didn't reach for anything. She didn't flinch, but something in her eyes shifted just a little. Enough for the man to pause. They stayed a few moments longer, tossing words like rocks. Then they climbed back into the truck, slammed the doors, and sped down the road without looking back. Dust curled into the air behind them, rising like smoke. Jane stood still until the sound of the engine faded. Then she turned and walked inside, locked the door, and sat at the table without speaking. Lily came close and asked if they were in trouble. Jane pulled her into her lap, wrapped her arms around her, and said everything was fine. But her mind was already moving, counting, measuring, remembering. The calm was still there, but so was the line she would not let them cross. The next evening came with a wind that bent the trees and carried the scent of unsettled earth. Jane sensed it before she saw anything. The way the birds grew silent, the flicker of light too far from the road. They were coming back like they said they would. She didn't panic. She told Lily it was time for a game, the kind where you hide and stay real quiet. Jane led her to the cellar beneath the barn, tucked behind stacked hay bales and a false wall of tools. It wasn't deep, but it was safe. She wrapped Lily in a blanket, handed her a flashlight, and told her to listen for her voice, and only her voice. Once the hatch closed, Jane moved with purpose, every step measured, every breath calm. She crossed the barn and opened a storage crate beneath the workbench. Inside, covered in a wool cloth, was the rifle she hadn't touched in years. The weight of it settled naturally into her hands. She checked the chamber, slid the bolt, and adjusted the scope with fingers that remembered too well. Her eyes scanned the perimeter through a crack in the boards. They were trying to move quietly this time. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Jane climbed to the hayloft and lay flat against the rafters. One man stepped into view below, flashlight shaking ever so slightly. She watched his pattern, waited for the pause in his step, then dropped a pile of straw just as he passed beneath. He turned, startled, and she dropped next. She landed silent behind him. One swift movement to his leg and he dropped. She bound his wrists with twine pulled from the hay bales and left him breathing but still. Two others were circling the house. Jane moved along the fence line, low and fast, cutting across the garden. She crouched near the chicken coop as one of them bent to inspect the cellar hatch. She tapped the scope of her rifle against the metal gate, just loud enough. He turned, flashlight sweeping. She stepped from the shadows and struck with a clean arc of the buttstock. He crumpled into the dirt without a sound. She dragged him behind the feed bins and turned her attention to the last one. He was the lookout, waiting near the road, back to the wind, checking his phone, and not much else. Jane moved up the side path, staying behind the tree line. Every step reminded her of the woman she used to be, of the calm she carried into combat zones. The same stillness now lived in her bones. She didn't use the rifle on him, just walked up behind, pressed two fingers to his shoulder, and waited for him to turn. He saw her face. That was enough. He froze. She didn't speak. He dropped the phone. She took the rope from her belt and tied him tight. When he asked what she was, she only said what mattered: a mother. Then she walked back toward the barn with the moon behind her, rifle at her side. The land was quiet again, and this time it would stay that way. The air held still, heavy with silence, as Jane crouched near the edge of the cornfield. The moon hung high, casting pale light through the thin clouds, just enough to shape shadows, but not give away her position. Her breath moved slow and steady as she watched them fan out across her land like they owned it. She had mapped every step in her mind. The traps were simple but precise. A wire stretched across the barn's west corner, a loose board at the well, broken glass buried shallow beneath the leaves near the path. It wasn't about damage. It was about disruption, confuse, distract, control. One of the men came first, tall and heavy-footed, moving toward the coop with a crowbar in hand. She followed him from a distance, staying just behind the tree-lined boots, pressing soft into damp earth. When he stepped past the chicken fence, the twine she'd tied to the latch snapped tight, triggering the old bell she'd strung above. He spun too fast, startled, and tripped over the rake she'd angled under straw. He hit the ground hard. Wind knocked out of him. Jane didn't give him time to recover. She crossed the distance quick and pinned him with her knee-wrapping rope around his wrists before he caught his breath. She rolled him into the tall grass and moved on. The second man was quieter, smarter. He moved around back past the shed where the shadows were thickest, but Jane had left her wheelbarrow tipped just enough to funnel him toward the stacked wood. He brushed the edge and knocked down two pieces. Not loud, but enough. She was above him on the roof before he realized it. She lowered herself to the edge and waited. When he came to the corner, she dropped. Her boots landed soft behind him. One hand grabbed his shoulder. The other pressed the muzzle of her rifle into his ribs. He froze. She tied his hands and left him sitting under the eaves, whispering to himself. The third intruder was more cautious. He carried a flashlight but didn't use it often. He was close to the barn door now, checking for movement. Jane climbed into the hayloft and crawled forward, watching from the broken slats. She tapped a nail loose from the beam, letting it fall. He turned, flashlight swinging, just in time to catch a glimpse of her eyes. That was all he got before she dropped down, grabbed his collar, and used his own momentum to flip him into the dirt. He thrashed once before she pressed her boot against his chest and told him not to move. He didn't. Leaves rustled on the north end of the property. Jane knew the last one had arrived. The leader. The one who talked loud and laughed louder. He stood near the tree stump where the ground was worn smooth from years of her daughter's play. He paced in a slow circle, muttering names under his breath. No one answered. Jane circled behind him, moving through the high brush, keeping low. Her rifle hung by her side now. She didn't need it anymore. The power had already shifted. He spun when he heard her boots in the dirt. His hand went to his belt. She stopped 3 steps from him, arms loose, chin raised. He pulled the pistol and pointed it low. She said nothing. just looked him in the eyes until his hand began to shake. He barked a threat voice cracking, but his feet stayed still. She stepped closer, told him the land wasn't for sale, told him she wasn't alone, told him if he raised that weapon again he'd leave in a stretcher or not at all. His arm dropped, slowly, then all at once. The gun hit the dirt and stayed there. Jane reached forward and relieved him of the weapon like she was taking scissors from a child. She tied his hands behind his back and led him toward the barn. The others were already there, groaning or silent. None looked at her. She didn't care. The moon dipped low behind the hills as Jane stood alone in the yard. The wind picked up, moving through the trees, soft as a breath. She turned back toward the house, toward the cellar door, and knocked twice. It creaked open and Lily peeked out, eyes wide. Jane nodded once. It was over. The night was quiet again, not because the danger had passed, but because she had met it and ended it. The first red and blue lights showed up just after dawn, flashing against the pale sky like a quiet apology for being late. The sheriff stepped out of his cruiser with slow purpose, his hand resting on his belt, eyes sweeping the yard. He didn't reach for his radio. He didn't ask what happened. The scene spoke for itself. 4 men bound in rope and baling twine lay spaced out across the property, some groaning, some too dazed to speak. Jane stood near the porch, arms crossed, hair still pulled back, eyes steady but tired. He walked toward her with a small nod. He didn't need details. He'd known Jane since the day she moved back, had heard rumors never confirmed about the kind of work she once did. Now he saw what that kind of woman looked like when someone gave her a reason. She didn't offer an explanation, and he didn't ask for one. He told her he'd take them in and keep it quiet as long as he could. Jane said thank you, and nothing more. The deputies showed up minutes later, murmuring to each other as they took photos and notes, glancing at Jane with sideways respect. She gave them names when she knew them, described what she had to, and stood back while they loaded the men into the cruisers. No reporters, no fuss, just the sound of cuffs clicking shut and gravel crunching under boots. It ended the way Jane preferred things, quiet and clean. When the last car pulled away, the sheriff turned back to her. He said it took guts to do what she did, said most folks would have run or begged or prayed for someone else to handle it. Jane looked out over the field where the wind moved soft through the corn and said she didn't have the luxury of waiting. He nodded once more, then asked if she was okay. She said she was now, and that was the truth. Lily ran out of the barn when it was over, her face still smudged from sleep and fear. She threw her arms around her mother's waist and asked if the bad guys were gone. Jane knelt down, held her tight, and said yes, they were gone for good. Lily leaned back and looked up, her eyes wide. She asked if Jane was a superhero. Jane smiled, brushed the hair from her daughter's forehead, and said she was just a mom doing what moms do. They walked back to the house together, hand in hand, past the coop, past the garden where nothing had changed and everything had. The coffee was cold by the time they sat down, but it didn't matter. The kitchen felt warm, whole, safe. Outside, the morning stretched wide and open. No one cheered. No music played. Just the hum of a fridge and the quiet breath of a girl who now saw her mother for everything she was. And Jane for once didn't feel the need to hide any of it. Most people don't look twice at a woman like Jane. She doesn't dress to stand out, doesn't speak unless there's a reason. She shops with a list, waves at neighbors, and gets her hands dirty in the garden every day. To the world, she's just a single mom with a tired truck and a house that creaks when the wind hits it wrong. But what they don't see is the strength in her silence, the way she watches, the way she listens. There's a kind of power that doesn't show up in loud voices or raised fists. It lives in the ones who get up before the sun and do what needs to be done, who don't need applause to know their worth. Jane never asked to be tested. She didn't want to fight, but when the line was crossed and her child was in danger, she didn't hesitate. She didn't become someone else. She became more of who she already was. Society tends to measure people by the wrong things, by the clothes they wear, the money they have, the noise they make. But none of that mattered when trouble came to Jane's door. What mattered was grit, focus, love, the kind that doesn't break when pushed, the kind that knows how to hold a rifle steady but still folds laundry while waiting on bread to rise. Some folks might say she was brave. Some might call her a hero. But she'd just say she was a mother who did what the moment asked of her. No more, no less. There are stories like hers in every quiet town on every forgotten road. People who look ordinary, who live simply, and who carry extraordinary things inside them. The kind of people who don't need to be seen to make a difference. Strength doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it walks barefoot across a wood floor and hums to itself while packing school lunches. Sometimes it whispers instead of shouting. Sometimes it plants roots and waits because it knows the storm won't last forever. The real lesson is not about defense or tactics. It's not even about danger. It's about seeing value in the people we overlook. It's about learning that peace is something you choose and protection is something you earn. Jane didn't reclaim her land to prove a point. She did it because it was hers, because her daughter needed to grow up knowing home was safe and sacred, because the world doesn't get to decide who's weak based on how softly they speak. Morning came with the same rhythm it always had. Birds chirped in the rafters. The wind moved gentle through the trees. Jane stepped outside in her worn flannel and boots, a basket on one arm, and Lily skipping ahead. They walked to the coop, laughing about which hen was the loudest. Jane reached under the straw, pulled out a warm egg, and handed it to her daughter like it was gold. The sun rose higher, casting light over the hills and the fence that still stood. There were no headlines, no medals, just a woman and her child beginning again. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that's what strength really looks like when no one's watching.